Hello, folks, and welcome to the Britt, Kanawha, West Hancock podcast. This is Dan Crawl, episode 61. We're recording this the night before the state semifinals, so in the morning here, I'll be heading to Cedar Falls to watch West Hancock play Linville-Sully. But before that, tonight here, I have Doug Sickles. Doug is a former teacher and coach at West Hancock Junior High in Kanawha. He's now the kindergarten through sixth grade principal at Crestwood Elementary in the Howard Wynn School District. How you doing tonight, Doug?
I'm doing great, Dan. Excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. I was telling Doug he's been requested by some people. That's always pretty fun when requests coming in. So this will be a good one. Before Doug and I start chatting, though, I have 18 sponsors for tonight. Like always, thank you, thank you, thank you. A lot of money pumping into the Sanger Legacy Fund. The Sanger Legacy Fund, like always, I tell you, is used for the West Hancock Hall of Fame. We give out scholarships to seniors. We support the athletic and activity funds. Hopefully another set of championship rings coming out to the football team here will help pay for. And then we help with any community outreach programs. If you want to sponsor the podcast or give, you can go to sangerstrong.com to learn more, to give, and get a hold of me. My sponsors are Noah Hellengay, the Dave Fink Memorial Fund, Christy Dusenberry and her book Before We Open Presents, Swenson's Hardware, Jade and Tyler Kalsdorf, Nick Schmidt, Window World of Mason City, Levi Dunn Trucking, Jan Rosga and her book Raw Survival, my brother Eric Krall of Ag Performance, Jay Hiscocks of State Farm Insurance, Kelly Real Estate, Derek and Liz Ing of Vexen Fishing and Tackle Industries, Miller and Sons Golf Cars, Daniels Auto Collision, Ewing Funeral Home and Monument Company, Justin Charbonneau, and the Britt Car Truck Bike and Tractor Night Cruise. Again, a lot of sponsors tonight, so thank you. Way back when, 5 episodes ago in episode 56 was Dan Cooper. 15 episodes ago in episode 46 was Dave Padderud. 30 episodes ago, episode 31 was Gene Guenther. 45 episodes ago in episode 16 was Chuck Buseman. And I added another one here since I have so many episodes now. 60 episodes ago in episode 1 was Kevin Sanger. Kelly Real Estate, if you're looking for just right starter home, the perfect forever home, a unique fixer-upper, or a transition into your retirement home, call Kelly Real Estate at 843-4102. Christy Dusenberry wrote the book Before We Open Presents. It's a great kids book reminding us of the real reason for Christmas. Christy goes to my church. It's a great book. We own it. I'll have a link to Amazon so you can buy the book. It's well worth $10. Levi Don Trucking. Thanks to Levi and his trucking company. You can get a hold of Levi at 860-0077 or look him up on Facebook. Nick Schmidt's another sponsor, like always. He's a 2000 West Hancock grad, played football for Coach Sickles in junior high. Nick always just wants to give back to the legacy fund in his community. Michael and Brianne Ewing of Ewing Funeral Home. Again, I think another former player. You can find him online at ewingfh.com or on Facebook. Call him at 843-3839 or 762-3211. Jade and Tyler Kalsdorf. Tyler and I played football together. He's a 2008 West Hancock grad, and they wanted to give back as well. So thank you to the Kalsdorfs. And then Daniels Auto Collision in Charles City. Call them at 220-3805. Email them at danielsautocollision@gmail.com or check them out at danielsautocollision.com. All right, Doug, here we go. Thanks again for coming on. Excited, I said, have some Kanawha flair. You taught in Kanawha, even though it was still in the West Hancock school system. Sometimes I have Kanawha people from pre-West Hancock times. It's kind of a fun mix here tonight. Thanks again. I appreciate it. Kind of get started here with your upbringing. I always like to know kind of the before you got to Britt, Kanawha, or West Hancock. Where'd you grow up? What was that like? Let's start with that.
Yeah, we'll start with that. But I guess before I start, I told you a little bit when we were talking earlier, when you sent this request, you sent me an email, and I'll tell you what, I was just so excited. It just had a kind of a lot of flashbacks to West Hancock and Kanawha. It was a great chapter in my life and my family's life. That's two of my 3 kids were born when we were in Kanawha. Just great experience. I taught with some great people. I had, great community sport, and the kids were second to none. So I did a lot of reminiscing, and then you said kind of remember names and stories, and I'm like, that's 20 some years ago. I remember some stories, and the names, some of them are coming back, especially when you hit the sponsors. But I sure don't want to shortchange anybody either. I would feel bad about that too.
Oh, don't worry
A
about it.
lot of great kids.
Everyone says that, and I always say no one will be offended if you forget them because you're on, you're under the spotlight. So don't worry about that.
Yeah. So I guess a little bit about me. I grew up in a small town, kind of like Britt, Reedland, Iowa, and Reedland and Fair make up Wapsie Valley. So at West Hancock, it was very familiar territory for me, and how important football was, and just a lot of things that I could relate to. Right after I graduated, shortly after that, I married my high school sweetheart, Marcia, and she's been my rock. If you are a coach's wife or administrative wife, you put up with a lot with us. So she's been my rock. And then after that, we had our oldest daughter, Ashley. Ashley ended up playing basketball at University of Wyoming, and now she is living in Lisbon. She's a teacher with her husband, Drew, and they gave us last year our first granddaughter, Ellie. So
Congrats.
that was pretty exciting. Then I have another daughter, Madison. Madison went to Grandview and played basketball in Des Moines, and her and her husband, Peter, live in Ankeny, and she's a teacher. And then my youngest daughter, Emily, she started out going to be a teacher, but she's our free spirit of the kid group, and she became a nurse like her mom, and she's a nurse in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And I guess after I left West Hancock, I moved to Cresco here, and been either a guidance counselor, coach, or administrator since.
Yep. And I said at the beginning, you're currently the K6 principal at Crestwood, right?
Yep, got it right around. Well, I'm actually preschool through 6, and got about 500 kids here.
That was my next question. I know you guys are kind of in that 2A, 3A range. Usually 3A, aren't you? In most.
Yeah, most sports we are 3A. Yep.
Yep, cool. Go back to Wapsie Valley here for a little bit because, like you said, West Hancock and Wapsie are a little intertwined. We played in the playoffs this year. 2 of the years that you were at West Hancock, we played them in the playoffs, 96 and 97. Yep. Jerry Southmaid, he was the head coach there. He was there, Bob Sanger. I coached with him at Central for 3 years. I love Jerry. Always enjoyed talking to him. Before we recorded, I asked Doug a little bit about Coach Southman. He goes, when you're in high school, you don't really know your coach that well because there's that different relationships. I don't know. Who knows? I might know Jerry better than you do at this point because I spent a ton of time in the office, ton of time on the field with him, and he was just a stand-up guy, and you never know what Jerry was going to say. But man, what was it like playing football for him and playing for Wapsie?
Well, I'll tell you what, Jerry was pretty young back then, but he was pretty intimidating. I told you that earlier. He had all our players' respect. So you probably do know him better. The one thing that I really jumped out at me is our sophomore year we were playing, and our sophomore class we had a really special player, and he was a running back, and I remember this so clearly. So we were running some drills against the varsity, and I remember this kid got the handoff, and he kind of tiptoed through the line, and some of the older kids kind of smacked him pretty good. And I just still remember Jerry meeting him as he got up, meeting his face mask. And he kind of told him in no uncertain terms, that's not how you play football at Wapsie, and, all of us average to a little above average players were like, oh my God, but Jerry knew which buttons to push on which kid, that player I'm talking about, he became a 2-time All-Stater. He played college ball. He became an All-American in college. So, that's my biggest memory about Jerry.
Yeah. What was that player's name, just for reference?
JP Baczynski.
Okay. Do you remember where he played in college?
One of the Dakota schools.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah. One of the Dakota schools. Yep.
So you went to UNI. What led you to go to UNI to get your teaching and coaching? And then what was your first teaching job?
Well, it was kind of interesting. I wasn't planning on going to UNI right away. I actually played my first year at baseball at Waldorf.
Okay.
And was having pretty good success at baseball. And I thought I'd play there one more year and then go somewhere and play baseball. But it's one of those things that at the time you think it's a bad deal. It ended up being a great deal for me, but at the time I wasn't happy. In springtime, I got called into the financial aid department at Waldorf, and I was told that somehow my parents or I goofed up the financial aid, and in order to go to Waldorf the next year, I would have to pay for it all out of pocket.
Oh.
And and my parents couldn't afford it. I couldn't afford it. So I ended up moving back. Actually, Reedland's only a half hour from UNI.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked this semester on a farm, and then I just continued working nights on a farm and attending UNI. I from a young age, I knew I wanted to be a teacher coach, and UNI has a great program for both of those. An interesting thing about my senior year, my last semester, I got done student teaching, and my mom decided to go back to class. So she went to a community college in Cedar Falls. So my mom and I, we carpooled to college together. So that was, and I didn't mind it one bit. I let her drive as I was kind of studying. So
who got better grades?
I'll just leave it there.
That pause said enough right there. There we go.
Yeah.
Yep. So
my mom was a lot more serious about it.
Yeah, that sounds about like my college career too.
Yeah.
Were either of your parents teachers then? Is that what made you want to teach, or did you have some?
No, actually, that's interesting. My mom for a long time was a daycare worker, and then she worked as a paraprofessional in school. And the student she was para for, that's why she went back to school. That kid was leaving. And actually, and I don't mean to discourage this, but my dad was a factory worker. And one of the things my dad told us boys is, find a job you love, so it's not a job. And honestly, growing up in a small town in the 80s, you were going to probably work on a farm, work in a factory, or probably be a teacher, something like that. Mm-hmm. Well, we didn't own a farm, and my dad discouraged factories. So, and I just had the utmost respect for my teachers going through school, and especially my coaches. I just love sports, and I just have a great deal of respect, and that's kind of how I got into the profession.
Nice. And where'd you end up then after college? Where was your first gig?
My first gig was actually it was Bishop Garrigan.
All right, we're gonna end the podcast right now. I'm just kidding. Garrigan, Britt, a little bit of a rival. So
yeah, I know that. Back when I was there, it wasn't as big a rival.
Yeah, it got big kind of late 90s, early 2000s is when it kind
of. And the interesting thing is I graduated UNI with a physical education degree. Mm-hmm. And back then, when you applied for a PE job, there was probably 80 applicants.
Yeah.
It was just, so I took the job at Bishop Garrigan. I was their junior high science teacher for 4 years, and then I became the high school PE teacher. So it was a good experience for me.
Yep. You coach.
I know
some baseball.
That black and gold. What's that?
I was just leaning into the next part. You coach baseball, correct? At Garrigan.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what, Coach Meister, he had a good influence on me. I think the three big takeaways I learned from him was about how to organize practice efficiently. Mm-hmm. And then I think I learned how you got to bring a lot of energy if you're a coach.
Yeah.
And then the other takeaway I got from him and Coach Sanger, and we'll talk about that a little later, is sports is just a vehicle to teach kids about life, and I learned that from Coach Meister and Coach Sanger. If we're coaching sports just for the sport's sake, probably shouldn't have it, and we're trying to help develop young men and young women. So, and the interesting thing, before I came to West Hancock, I actually had the same teaching job at West Hancock 2 years before that. They offered it to me, but Bishop Garrigan wouldn't let me out of my contract.
Oh,
yeah. I don't know if it was because I was a good teacher, or I think it was because it was later in the year.
yeah.
And I sucked it up and did it, but it's killing me in IPERS right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd probably be retired right now.
Those private schools, I tell you what, that hurts.
Yeah. And, you ask, why I switched. To be honest with you, the main reason I switched is I went from, I didn't especially like high school PE, and back then it's probably changed, but that wasn't a huge emphasis. PE was at Garrigan, and couldn't afford to raise a family really on that salary.
Yeah. Were you living in Algona at the time then?
Yeah, we were. Yeah.
Good community though. Nice town.
Yeah, it is. Yep.
So then you went from Garrigan to Kanawha, correct?
I went to Garrigan to Kanawha, West Hancock. It was West Hancock then.
Yep. What were your first kind of initial reaction to working in Kanawha, working at West Hancock?
I tell you what, I felt kind of at home, because I told you that those size communities is what I grew up in, and I just felt really at ease with it. I had a lot of good teachers. I was trying to flash back to some Ruth Verberge, Carolyn Bowman. They really welcomed me in, the mix, and just great kids there. I'll say that over and over again. As you reflect back in life, how lucky I was to have those kids.
Did Mrs. Bowman ever whack her yardstick at you by any chance?
No.
Did you hear stories about that in science class?
I actually don't. I think she might have been over that phase.
No, because when I was there after you left, and if a kid fell asleep in her science class, she'd take that yardstick and she would whack it down on the desk right next to you. You could, feel it underneath your fingertips, but it would never make contact with you. You did that once, and that's all it took, and you were straight up in your chair, and you were listening to every word she said after that.
That's funny, because the yardstick thing, when I taught at Algona, the junior high, we were at, I don't know if a lot of people know this, we were at the old St. Joe's building.
Okay.
And I probably had 3 or 4 nuns that taught there too.
Yeah.
And one day I was talking to some of the junior high kids about, we were talking about science fair or something. And I remember one of the nuns coming in and whacking my desk because they were late for her class. And so I made the note not to let them be late for her class.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you mentioned Mrs. Verberge as well. She was my math teacher, and she's now the principal there.
Yeah.
She, if I had to guess, she's probably been the principal there for close to 10 years now, would be my guess. It just seems like that sounds about right. But
yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. Because one of the things you got to realize since I came to Crestwood is every time there's a game or something, there's besides our Crestwood team, there's Wapsie Valley and West Hancock. I follow. Yep. I still follow them and still root for them.
Yep. So how did you feel with the Wapsie West Hancock game the other night, a couple weeks ago? Were you happy either way?
I was happy either way, but I probably I coached Mark.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Rick before, so I don't have really any direct connection to the kids at Wapsie now. I probably have more direct connection to the kids I coached you know,
Yeah.
and I taught and their kids, you know.
Yeah. You would have had Kevin Eisman in baseball. He's the offensive coordinator now.
Yeah.
Ryan Johnson's kind of the co-coordinator and the line coach.
Okay.
Would you have had Paul Francis? Did he play
Yes.
baseball?
Yes.
Yep, he's one
Yep.
of the assistants. Stacy Gopel and his son are assistants. Stacy would have been right around the time you got there. He didn't play baseball, I know that for sure,
Yeah.
but pretty much that whole coaching staff minus one Garner guy that's coaching now. You had some kind of connection with. Yep.
Yeah. How'd you get a Garner guy in there? That's
Yeah, and his
kind of
brother's the head coach for Garner.
What's that?
His brother's the head coach at Garner right now.
Oh, really?
CJ Camrad, good dude. He had moved to Britt for I think his wife's job, and yeah, he's a good addition to the staff. But yeah, Mark, before tomorrow's game, he's 46-2 in 4 years as head coach with 2 state titles.
Wow.
He's take what his dad made and he's just run with it even more. So
yeah. I kind of got, as we go along here, I kind of got I am sure it was Mark and not Jeff. I kind of got a funny Mark Sanger football story. So
you can tell it right now if you want. Go for it while it's on your mind.
Okay, it's on my mind. I still, you know, back when I was at Kanawha, West Hancock, we really didn't know the Britt kids, elementary kids, you know, coming in, you know. So I really didn't, you know, I had Rick for baseball for that summer. Then I had Jeff, and then I met Mark. And I think the first time I really met Mark was that first day of football when we handed out equipment. And I still remember Mark sitting in the front row of the bleachers when we handed out equipment and literally just rocking. And I swear to God, if I would have went passed out equipment alphabetically, he would have tackled me. You know, and I'm sure this was Mark too, when you know, the West Hancock kids, a lot of times in football back then, you know, they just kind of knew the game. And when I had him as a 7th grader, it was kind of unusual, but we ran a no huddle offense for series a lot of times because the other teams really didn't know what was going on. Yeah. And it was just 2 plays to the left and 2 to the right. And they're the same plays. You know, we'd run a dive, and then we'd run a trap or a counter off that.
Yep.
And I remember that first series, his first game, and we were just running that, and we were no huddle. We were pounding the ball, and I think we were about at the 8-yard line. And you know how 7th grade kids are, all of a sudden there's a commotion out there. And I look out there, I was trying to call the play, but I see him all kind of huddled up. And Mark, I don't know if he was on his knees. I think he was just grabbing his knees. And I'm like, oh my God, you know, it's first game. We really don't have a lot of backups installed here.
Yeah.
And I said, so I went out there, and I don't know if Mark just couldn't catch his breath a little bit or his dry heaving a little bit. So I took him out of the game, and he got some water, and you know, I think I was a great coach and sat him out at least 1 play, if not 2, because I wasn't going to be able to contain it. But I remember after the game, Mark's mom telling me that he hadn't slept the whole night. He was just so angry. You know, isn't that West Hancock football though?
Yeah.
You know,
and being the youngest Sanger and his dad's the coach, that was his time to like finally, you know, because there wasn't the youth league padded football like there is now. That was his first time to show what he could do out there. That's great.
Yeah.
And he is now the head coach, and he's 5 years, so he's like 40. I bet you he's not going to sleep a whole lot tonight either for tomorrow morning's game. Every time I text him, he goes, I'm, you know, kind of a little nervous, or, you know, when someone tells me, yeah, Mark's a little nervous about this kid. And I'm like, that's good. I'm glad. That's a sign of a good coach and someone who cares. So,
well, I remember even when we had, you know, my basketball team here in 2018 was probably superior to about everybody, but God, before every state tournament game, you were just kind of, you were watching game tape. Mark probably knows it too. You know the plays right when it happens. You know what play is going to be run. So yeah, that's a great coach.
Yeah, good deal. Let's talk a little West Hancock baseball though, and then we'll come back to some middle school football and stuff. You took over the baseball program. You started your career with Rick Sanger, Kevin Eisman, John DeLeon, and I call him Nasty Nate Sure, one of the meanest guys you'll ever meet.
Yeah.
What was it like with that group of guys taking over the baseball program?
I tell you what, that was a little bit interesting because I was coming from Bishop Garrigan. At first, they weren't going to let me out of my contract to coach baseball there, and the only way I got out of my baseball contract at Bishop Garrigan is I had to be the 8th and 9th grade softball coach in the morning. Oh. So I would do 8th or 9th grade softball, and I think my oldest daughter was like 3 or 4. Then I'd come over and coach baseball. And I'll tell you, the thing that really just stuck out when I had those kids is the leadership. Mm-hmm. I do a lot of drill work in baseball where kids are at different areas of the diamond. And I think the first couple of weeks before the season really got started, I don't even know if I had an assistant yet. I think it might have been a college kid or something. And I just was amazed at, Rick and that group, that how serious they took it. And there was no goofing around. And, the one, I guess kind of the one regret I had about that group is I think one of the absolute keys to being a good coach is having a relationship with your kids.
Yeah.
And I came in there blind in May, so I would like to have them a couple of years to, just to know which buttons, how to handle certain kids, so I look back at that and that's one of my regrets about that group, the great group, I think we got second in conference that year. And I coaches are always pretty hard on themselves, Yeah. We hardly ever remember our victories, and so, but just the character of those kids was just second to none.
Yeah. Well, Doug, have you watched any of these other podcast episodes I've done with a lot of these good athletes from Britt, West Hancock? What pretty much comes down to, we spend half the time talking about the handful of games that they lost, and then we brush past the games that we won. And I mention that often because I'm like, where else, it's like we're successful all around in most everything. So of course the losses stick out, and I'm like, all right, we've talked about this loss for 10 minutes. Let's talk about a good win or something big that happened. And people are like, oh yeah, I didn't even realize it. That's just what's fresh in your mind. So
it's kind of funny you say that, because I was very fortunate. The kids, I had a state championship team in 2018 in basketball, but my oldest daughter's team got beat to go to state by Marion, and that I remember that game more than state championship game.
Yeah,
I wake up at night, Yep. So I totally understand what you're saying.
Yep, if you went back and watched every podcast I've done up until yours tonight, that theme comes up about every other episode I've done. So, yep. Was that assistant coach you had? Was that Mark Timmerman then that first year, or was he the second year?
You sent that, and I can't remember if it was the first year or it was I to be honest with you, I can't remember. Yeah. I just remember Mark when he came in. As I think it was the first year now I think about it, but He was very organized, professional. But the interesting thing is I got to know Mark 3 years ago better than I did then, because when I took over principal, Mark, I don't know if people know that around Britt, West Hancock, Mark is a guru at teacher evaluations.
Yeah.
And so I kind of got to pick his brain a bunch of times about that. So that was cool to have that connection.
Yeah, and well, I live in Indianola right now, and that's where Mark lived up until just this year.
Yep.
And so him and I would get together, and then whenever his parents were in town, he'd invite me over, and I'd reminisce with his folks. Great dude, and yeah, he's at Western Dubuque now as kind of the assistant superintendent, and then he like trains the principals to help
Yep.
train the teachers. That's his new gig, so he's done a nice job.
Well, actually, the connection there is Indianola is up until this year, my superintendent. He just moved to Indianola to be the superintendent.
Oh, that's right. What's his name?
Ted Inns.
Yep, there we go. Yep,
yeah.
I know the name.
Yeah.
We're actually moving in 2 weeks from Indianola to down where we teach at I-35. So
okay,
slowly getting disconnected from Indianola in a weird way, but we've lived here for 10 years.
Yeah.
One thing I found in the newspaper that was kind of cool, Don Hiscocks, I'm sure you remember Don.
Yeah.
Dingers for dollars. I put that in the note. He pledged to give $3 for every home run hit because he said your baseball bats were in bad shape when you took over the program and wanted to help you get some new bats. How many home runs were hit during dingers for dollars?
I until you sent that, I totally forgot about it, and I always say this, back when I coached baseball, it was a different world. You got to see your baseball players during the start of baseball practice. You got no contact with them. And one of the things that West Hancock had when I was there, we had such a dang good track team too.
Yeah.
And so a lot of my baseball players would go to state track, and Bob was kind enough to let me have them for a little while, do some drill work. So I blame the not hitting on just not getting them enough. I don't know if that's true, but I think even when I coached softball here, I always hung my hat on pitching and defense. Offense tells you how much you're going to win the game by.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I thought that was kind of neat.
What's that?
I thought that was kind of neat. Dingers for dollars, and then Don Hiscocks, of course.
You can tell Don to send me some of that money.
Yeah, he never got it to you.
Yeah, I don't think so.
never hit a home run apparently, but maybe he should have doubles for dingers or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right, I'm going to hit some sponsors and we're going to talk some West Hancock football. Showalter family in Window World of Mason City is a proud supporter of the podcast. Once an Eagle, always an Eagle. Fly High, Coach Sanger, and Joey Showalter. Jan Rosga wrote a book called Raw Survival. She's from my church. The book talks about her son's death and how to help you if you're grieving. I have a video that I'll post and then the Amazon link so you can buy that book as well. And thanks to Jan Rosga for telling her story. The Dave Fink Memorial Fund. Dave Fink taught and coached at West Hancock for several years back when I was in school. Before he moved on to Waverly Shell Rock, he passed away in 2016 at the age of 41, left behind his 3 sons and his wife. The Dave Fink Memorial Fund raises money to give out scholarships to graduating seniors at Waverly, helps fund the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and continues to support the Waverly Shell Rock football program. So please consider giving to the Dave Fink Memorial Fund. Noah Hellengay, he's been very excited for this episode, Doug. He's asked me about 4 times when it's going to air, and I finally
I remember him.
It's coming up. Noah's a 2006 West Hancock grad, has a lot of respect for you, and is excited for the episode, so he wanted to sponsor tonight.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah, he's a good dude. The Jay Hiscocks State Farm Team in Britt's proud supporter of West Hancock and the Legacy Fund. Give Jay or Lindsay a call at 843-3563. Then Miller & Sons Golf Cars, family-owned operation with over 50 years of experience. Give Skip and Jim a call at 843-4132. Check them out at millergolfcars.com. All right, let's talk some football here. When you also came to West Hancock, you also taught or coached junior high football with Mr. Miller. Talk about Alan a little bit.
Well, I'll tell you what, we came in at the same time, and, I think that made the transition pretty seamless. I think we were both about the same age, but I think a lot of energy, to each other. We're competitive with each other, and we'd switch, he'd have an 8th grade group, I'd have a 7th grade group. And then a lot of times we would be the different coordinator sometimes. So it was just, it was fun times coaching with Alan. And then we did, besides football, we did some basketball together too.
Where did he come from? Do you remember where he came to Kanawha from?
I think Clarksville.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it was Clarksville. Yep.
And where is he now? Do you guys still keep in contact a little bit?
Not really. He was, oh my God, I do remember the school. He was Southern Iowa as a superintendent. When he left West Hancock, he became a principal. And then he was a superintendent down in Southern Iowa.
Do you know if he still is then? I probably could.
I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, I could look him up and find him if he's, in administration probably.
Yeah.
So, you guys were the feeder system for Coach Sanger. You were that, like you said, with Mark's story earlier, you were that first piece that those kids got to experience of West Hancock football that they grew up watching and, idolizing and getting ready for. You had an 8th grade team, and that would have been your first year. Not too bad of a group. They ended up being state champions as seniors in '96.
I went to that game. I was at that game.
Yep, and that was the only game that season I missed. I woke up with the flu, and my mom wouldn't let me go.
Oh my goodness.
Yep, got to see them all. But yeah, Ben Evans, Jeff Sanger, Chad Klein, Jeremy Heyer, Nick May, Corey Rasmussen, Nick Drake. What was it like back then with those guys as middle schoolers?
Well, the thing that really, that group, and they were just so competitive, whether we were doing drill work or games, they didn't want to lose, and the great thing about that group is, they just pushed themselves and they pushed each other to be great. I always said I had a lot of those same kids in baseball, and that almost ultra competitiveness kind of hurt them in baseball, because if they struck out or something, they were pretty angry, but just, oh my goodness, they were just competitive. And I got to tell you the truth. I had that group in football and in junior high basketball, and I think they were just as good in junior high basketball.
Yeah.
And just because that will to win. I mean, one of my memories of that group when we were playing at that time, there was a conference school that had a really pretty good point guard. And the first time we played him, he kind of hurt us a little bit. And I remember kind of challenging that group. You couldn't play zone back then, but obviously if you got a screen on you, you could switch. Mm-hmm. And I remember playing that team, and you couldn't press back then, and he'd kick that ball to the wing, and I don't think one time in the first half he ever got that ball back. Yeah. That group just swallowed him up, and the game was over by halftime, so that's what it really just stood out with me with that group is just. And I tell you what, when I got to go to see that state championship game, I was just so proud. A question you maybe didn't ask, but you sent it to me, is kind of about the feeder system. One of the things is, before I came to West Hancock, we always ran both Wapsie and Garrigan ran the I. Yeah. So it was kind of new world for me. And I remember, I asked, not Martin, Jim Timmerman. Yep. He was a former coach. If he'd come down and kind of help me with some things with the blocking schemes and things like that. And I remember this. It was at Kanawha, and we were coming out the back door, and Jim and I were talking, and the kids were kind of going ahead of us to the field. And Jim goes, "This is football. Why are they walking?" And I said, all right, and so that just showed you how intensity, those kids and those expectations were, know.
Yep. I don't remember ever being able to walk from a drill to the water or back to a drill. It was,
Yeah.
and your helmet was always on too. That was a big deal. You never took
Yeah.
your helmet off in practice or a game.
Yeah.
Kept
Yeah. And I still remember that. It was a great lesson to learn, and it just kind of set the tone.
Yep.
A lot of people think it's those big superstar plays that make the game or the team. It's the little things. And I'm sure Mark has that and Bob had that attention to detail.
Oh yeah. Yep. If you watch them nowadays, last year's championship team darn near mistake free. That team did not mess up. This team's getting pretty close to that too. And I mean, they are sticklers for the fundamentals and doing things right. And then I think
Yeah, they don't
everyone's
take.
favorite part, the physicality. We just wear down teams, and I'm sure you remember that.
Yeah.
It was just ground and pound and let them
Well,
have it.
I have kind of a wearing down. I kind of have a funny story about that in football. One of our conference schools, when I was coaching, they had a really, I think his dad played Division I, and he was an eighth grader, and he was a really good nose guard. He was bigger than any of our kids, and I still remember this. The kids were saying, "Oh, they're going to come out and get us this year." And I don't know if you went when you were playing. We would do a block called the post lead, where the center would hike the ball and the center would kind of get under shoulder pads, and the guard would come down and double team.
Yep. Oh yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and by the halftime, that kid was wore out.
Yeah.
Our kids just post leaded that kid to death. And that's just that physicality. He was making plays in the first quarter. By second or third quarter, he wasn't making those plays.
Yep. And that's been the staple of the program for decades now. It's you get to end of the half, start of the second half, and you can tell the other team is about ready to be done. Call it a day.
Yeah.
Yep. What about some of your other groups of kids that you had? That first group, state champs. The next group ended up going to the semis. Jake Zool and Mike Stripling, some of those kids. Um, then you go all the way up through your last couple years. Your last year missed me by 1 year. If you would have stayed around one more year, I would have been in seventh grade. So your last group ended up being like Ryan Pritchard, Taylor
Yeah.
Van Weinboom, Justin Plum, and then you would have had like Aaron Rasmussen, Derek Ing, Mitch Horseman, Zach
Yeah.
Nielsen, just throwing out a few off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Just in general, or specifically, what do you remember about some of those
Well,
groups?
I think what I remember about Ryan Pritchard is he played baseball for me, and he was a lefty, if I remember right.
I'm
And
not
I,
sure.
and I just had trouble throwing a little bit of strikes once in a while. You just gave me a lot of flashbacks of names there. It's been 20 years. I think the cool thing about West Hancock is all those kind of teams blend together because all their personalities, have that same identity of just we're going to outwork you, we're going to be physical, and team. I got a kind of a one of the things that really stuck out at me. I learned from Bob is I was talking to Bob. We had started practice, junior high practice, and I was in Britt one time, and Bob and I were talking about it. And I think it was a move-in kid. I can't really remember, but this junior high kid was he was a lot more mature than the other kids.
Mm.
And, and just maybe a little better. And Bob and I were talking about it. And it struck me, and it's so true. Bob goes, well, this kid is, so much mature in that. He says, I worry about that. And I said, Bob, he's really good. He said, how's his work ethic? And I said, well, and he says, well, in his experience, if they're always really great when they're younger and they don't have the work ethic, the other kids pass them by, and I walked out of there thinking, he's telling me this, but then as you mature as a coach, you totally understand what he was talking about.
Yep. He had seen it all by that point, I'm sure too.
Yeah.
Just years and decades of seeing it.
Yeah.
So from 92 to 98, what kind of record do you think you had as a junior high football coach at West Hancock, you and Alan?
You said that, and I think I recall one year we had 2 losses, and I know no other year we had less than 1 loss, and quite a few years we had no losses. But one of the questions you sent me that you were considering asking is, what was the pressure like? I never got any pressure from Coach Sanger. That was the neat thing. Coach Sanger wanted our program to teach the fundamentals, and teach teamwork and work ethic.
Yeah.
And you've always obviously been around sports long enough. If you take care of the process, the outcome will come.
Yeah.
Exactly. So.
Yeah. And I just remember, granted, I didn't have you as a coach, but I had Ben Muller, Terry Heeman, then Mr. Smith. I'm drawing a blank on his name. They were my junior high football coaches, but we ran what the high school ran, maybe a few wrinkles here and there. But when we got to high school football, he would have okay, senior group, junior group, sophomore group, freshman group, we're going to run 245 dive.
Yep.
And that was the first day of practice. It wasn't okay, here's what 245 dive is. It was, let's go. And we were running it. And I mean, granted, there was mistakes, but it was 10 times farther ahead than we were if we didn't have that type of junior high program where
exactly,
we already knew that stuff. And so I felt like we were always ahead of the 8 ball a little bit, ahead of the curve.
I will tell you this, so a little bit. I remember I had Ben Evans and a couple other kids, and I will tell you this: some people come to the junior high games to watch a little more passing than the high school did.
3 times or what?
Oh, we might have passed 6 times, but it was funny. I still remember that some of they were passing more to the high school.
Yeah. Well, Chad Klein, he was, I told this story so many times. He was the quarterback for this 96 team. He won a state championship without completing a pass in 4 playoff games.
Yeah.
That's gotta be a record. I mean, in the history of high school football, a quarterback never completing a pass just is mind blowing.
Well, I believe, I told that basketball story about that kid never getting the ball back.
Yeah.
I believe Chad Klein was on him.
That's what I was going to ask you earlier.
I believe Chad was on him.
My second guess was going to be Jeff Sanger, and not because he's as fast as Jeff, but when that guy's mad and has something he needs to get done, he's going to get it done. That wouldn't have surprised me either.
Well, I still remember, Jeff played basketball and he wrestled, and I still remember everybody trying to stack the deck to wrestle Jeff, other teams. And then he ended up, playing basketball. I think he did through high school,
Yep, he did.
And I just remember, he could have played anything and he's going to be competitive,
Yep, he's going to be good at it.
Yeah.
You wanted to talk about Coach Sanger a little bit more specifically here. I think this is a good time as any since we're talking about it. What are some things about Coach Sanger you want to bring up?
Well, let me get to that. Well, I got just a couple more football stories, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for
it. Just a couple quick ones. I cannot remember their first names, but we had a Hartman boy and a Muth boy.
Be Josh and Mark, probably. They were in Mark Sanger's grade.
Yeah, they weren't very big when I had them in junior high.
No.
And I remember one of the football games. I remember this distinctly, that Alan Miller was kind of at half when we were warming up. He was at the half, and he come up and he said, "Oh, that coach says that they're going to run a lot of stuff outside because those 2 are my cornerbacks."
Yeah.
And the first 2 series they pitched both sides, and those 2 kids came up, and that was the end of them pitching it. I still remember that.
Josh was on a podcast for me a couple months ago. He won a Super Bowl, athletic trainer for the Denver Broncos.
Are you kidding me?
And he was one of the dozen or so people that Peyton Manning invited to go to his Hall of Fame ceremony with.
Oh my goodness.
Yep. So he's done pretty well out there in Denver.
Yeah, yeah. And then I can't remember. I wish I knew the two boys' names. It would make the story funnier. But one time we were running a trap, and both guards thought they were supposed to pull, and they hit so hard they were both on their backs with their feet up. The kids are all mad. I said, "That's awesome." How hard they're going. So
do you remember what season it was? I know you said they blend together a little bit, but
God, I can't remember. If I had I told Marcia, I said, if I had a yearbook, I would have probably recognized the names. It was just.
There's going to be enough people watching this that I guarantee you someone remembers it, and I'll probably get a message. So if you're out there watching this and you remember that, or that was you, please let me know. That'd be great, because then lots of good material would come from that.
Yeah. Oh, I guess I want to talk about Bob. I thought after you mentioned being on this, what made Bob special, and to me it was his value system, and he never wavered for that, and he was just authentic, and I think the people at West Hancock probably realize how special that is to have, somebody like that. And then I just remember, football wasn't the end all. He taught about life, and the other thing, he just loved West Hancock, and and one of the things I remember, I last time I talked to Bob, I was at Osage, and I was scouting Osage for maybe a state playoff run in basketball, and they were playing West Hancock, and Bob seen me up, and he came and sat by me, and I don't know if I got any scouting done that whole game. I seriously don't think so, but sometimes when you go scout, you just kind of look for the speed of the game and the speed of the kids.
Yeah.
And the thing that struck me when I was driving home is the whole conversation was about me. He was interested in who I was.
Yep.
And that just struck me. That's what, just made him a great person and a great coach.
So. Did you, besides like that, a run-in situation, were you in contact with him much throughout the years?
Oh, not really. I remember when I was there, we had I was sitting in a meeting with kind of a tough meeting with a high school kid and his parents. Mm-hmm. And I remember, this could be a tough situation. But Bob came into that meeting, and the thing that struck me is, you thought the parents were going to be a little ornery. They knew Bob had their kids' best interest at heart, and so that meeting was incredible, so.
Yep. Sounds about right. Yeah. And you would have been there at the tail end of Al De Leon's career too. So you talk about how special it was that we had Coach Sanger. We had Al De Leon, we had Gene Perkins, Jim Timmerman. I mean, the list goes on. It was pretty special
it was a special time there.
Yep. Anything else on West Hancock football that stands out to you?
Oh, I probably could talk for a long time about it. I just have, and I think you understand this if you're a coach, you teach all day, and it's just so refreshing when you go out there and you have all those young guys that want to be there, and would die for you at that time.
Did you guys ever use the Kanawha Bulldog jerseys that were in the shed for practice?
No, never.
That must have started with the coaches I had, because I think, if I remember right, when you got to be an 8th grader, they pulled out the old Kanawha Bulldog jerseys, and the sleeves went down to about your wrist. For the smaller guys. But I wasn't sure if you guys started that or how that went, but that was always a big deal.
Well, it's kind of funny how life is. You mentioned Ben Mullers. I coached Ben at Bishop Garrigan.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And now he's my daughter's principal at Ankeny. So
Oh, nice. And I hear nothing but amazing things about him.
yep. So
That's a good connection. Yep, Ben was a good one. He was my basketball coach. I think he did girls basketball the first part of the season and then boys basketball
yeah.
because I was one of his managers. And my graduating class, we were not very athletically inclined in the girls department. And
Yep.
I'd sit on the bench with him as his manager. And I think he just needed someone to console with a little bit as he was watching his team get beat 63-2. Do you remember those little backboards in the gym there?
Yep.
They were the old school ones from Kanawha high school days. We had a girl shoot a free throw that went over the top of the backboard, hit the wall, hit the back of the backboard, hit the wall, and bounced right back to her at the free throw line one game. And Mr. Moeller kind of just looked at me and he goes, he's like, I don't know if I get paid enough or something. Here's some line like that for it. And I'm like, I don't get paid at all.
Yeah.
To sit here through it. So
Yeah.
Exactly. He's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to hit our last sponsors and we're going to wrap things up and talk about kind of your takeaways and kind of what you're doing now and all that stuff. Derek and Liz Ing are my sponsors. They're with Vexing Fishing and Tackle Industries. Go to vexen.com. That's VEXAN and tackleindustries.com. Thanks to Derek and Liz, two West Hancock grads for sponsoring this episode. And then Justin Charbonneau messaged me a couple weeks ago and wanted to sponsor this episode. He has a lot of fond memories of Coach Sickles as well. So thanks to Justin.
I remember him greatly. Yeah.
Yep. Probably Brett Lang too. If you remember Justin Charbonneau, you probably remember Brett Lang.
Yeah.
Have some good stories of him. The Britt Car, Truck, Bike, and Tractor Night Cruise. They are sponsoring the podcast long term. Check out BrittCarCruise.com. Contact Jared Wingert, owner of Mojo Productions, at 408-1074. Then we have Swenson's Hardware is your local independently family-owned hardware store since 1977, located in downtown Britt. Check them out at swensons.doitbest.com. And then Eric Kroll, my favorite brother, with Ag Performance in Buffalo Center. Contact Eric at 341-3361 if you're looking for a higher net return on your fields. That's Eric Kroll with Ag Performance. Real quick, are any good middle school basketball stories besides the Sanger-Klein group? You did girls, boys? Did you do both?
Well, girls were interesting because I was kind of right at the time we were switching from 6-on-6 to 5-on-5.
Oh, that's right.
So I can understand what Ben went through a little bit, but we're all in that boat, and it was just teaching the fundamentals, and I really just basketball. It was a time in my life that the kids were competitive and I was ultra competitive.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there's a lot of referees back then when I was young that said, "Glad he's gone."
Yeah. So you left Kanawha in 1999. Again, right before I got there. What was the reason for leaving? Where did you end up from there? I can't remember if there was a spot between there and Crestwood or not.
No, it's actually, it's kind of, I think this is a little more of a fate story. Marsh and I, we were probably planning on, put our roots in West Hancock. We enjoyed it so much, but I still remember it was a spring in service that we had at Kanawha, and I was sitting in the lunchroom, and all of a sudden one of the secretaries came up and told me my mom was calling. And I knew from the fact that from when I walked to that lunchroom to the phone that my life would make a drastic change, because my mom's old school. She still doesn't call me during school, and I think that's the only time she's ever called me during school. And so got the phone call, found out my dad had a brain tumor, and the prognosis didn't sound great. And it was kind of interesting. I don't know if it was that weekend or the following. We made a trip to Reedland to go see my dad. And then we had to go to Harmony, Minnesota, which is a half hour north of Cresco on that Sunday for, I don't know if it was First Communion, I can't remember, but we drove through Cresco, and I said, Cresco's a town about 4,000, 4,000 to 5,000. I said, this wouldn't be a bad town. And, if we have to move, it's 1 hour from my parents. And so back in the day, the only way you found out about jobs was the Des Moines Register classifieds. And I got home that weekend, and sure enough, there was a counseling job at Crestwood. And a few weeks later, I was hired. If you had asked me a month before that, I would have said, "You're crazy. I'm looking for a job." But then the day after we moved in, that we slept one night here, and the next morning my dad died.
Oh, geez.
So yeah. So sometimes there's bigger powers than us, and I would love to stay at West Hancock, but it wasn't meant to be. So I guess that's my fate story.
Yeah. It all works out. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I know you probably already hit on some of this, but my last question here was like, just what do you take away from that time you had at Kanawha and at West Hancock? What are the things that'll stick with you and you'll always remember?
I'll tell you what, I think that the thing that really sticks out is it was a great chapter in my life. I would say a lot of my teaching, I really learned from a couple mentors at Bishop Garrigan, but kind of who I became as a coach, and probably a person happened at West Hancock. And anytime people talk about West Hancock, I just can't speak highly enough about the school, the community, the kids I had. I was talking to somebody tonight, and somebody asked me what I was going to do tonight. And I said I was doing a podcast, and they thought that was kind of neat that you do these things. And I said, the behavior issues I had back at West Hancock, I would take any day of the week, here. Kids have changed, things have changed. So just great memories.
Yeah. And that's interesting you say that. I'm a teacher, and I always not argue, but I always bring up the point, like, I don't know if kids have changed as much. It's just the environment, society, and parenting a lot of the time. And most parents I know have great intentions. It's just there's so many other distractions in this world anymore that we didn't have back then.
Well, when you mentioned about childhood, I forgot to say that. I think I grew up one of the greatest times in history where you could play the sport that was in season, and you didn't have technology, and I would agree with you. My old counseling background, people do the best they can, but with technology and, all the distractions, it's just hurting society right now. I got on my soapbox. Sorry about that.
The neat thing, talking about West Hancock, is you've been in the coaching world and the teaching world, administrative world. So you're around a lot of different people, a lot of different schools. You've seen the ebbs and flows of schools having success and then not having success in athletics. I mean, especially in the small school world, you go a class or two without maybe a lot of good athletes, you have a 5-6 year slide where you're average at best. You look at a school like ours, and we're, you can date all the way back to the 50s for wrestling, where we've been pretty good with a little stretch here and there. But football, it's been since 1984. We have been phenomenally good, dynasty like, especially right now. But in most small schools, you lose a good class and you pay for it for a few years with mediocrity at best. And then you said the person that said, "That's cool, they're doing a podcast." And I'm like, there's hundreds and hundreds of people I can pick to have on this thing because of the success they had and the connections they made. It's almost an endless list of people. And I think that's pretty neat, about our school and about our communities. So,
yeah, and it goes all the way to 3A. When I was girls basketball coach, if you had a bad class or so, a lot of times it took a lot of recovery, and so.
Yeah. And right now, man, if our football team loses before the dome, we're like, oh, what a disappointing season. And I'm like, 95% of the state would be thrilled to be disappointed with a quarter, to make it to the quarterfinals or whatever. It's just been
Yeah.
a lot of fun to watch these kids. So
I'll tell you what, we won the first 2 rounds of the playoffs here,
mhm.
and our football coach is God right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just, I think that's one of the takeaways. I hope that the people at West Hancock appreciate.
Yeah.
This is not done by accident. These coaches and kids put in a lot of hard work, whether it's football. I've followed young girls basketball a lot. It's not done by accident.
Yep. And you haven't been there for 20 some years now. You easily could be looking back and going, yeah, back when I was there, we were good. Now we're not. It's like, no, we're still there, almost maybe even better in some aspects.
I haven't got to a West Hancock game since really they won that championship, but I heard, do they go out of shotgun sometimes now?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd tell you what, I heard that.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't believe it. I thought people, I talked to one of the refs, and I think it was the first or second year, and I almost called him a liar.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we have a 6'4", 235-pound kid who can run like a deer. And they put him back there in the gun and let him pick a side. He can throw it. He's jumping up in the passing records. The kid that he throws it to mostly is going to Iowa State, and he just became the all-time career and season leader in receiving.
Wow.
Receptions. He's still a ways in yards, but I made that football record book a couple years ago for Coach Sanger's career. Now I've added to it, and that passing and receiving section of the book doesn't get a lot of action.
No.
In these last few years, it's changed a lot because of these kids and the new schemes. So it's been a lot of fun to see.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
Not just running anymore, but that's still our bread and butter. So
you betcha.
You bet. Well, next up on the podcast, I have Steph Arey, who is a state champion in track, and then Brian Benning, former teacher and coach when I was in school. Steve Perkins, he's now coaching in Madrid. Don Hiscocks, who we mentioned earlier, all around great guy, good athlete, was huge in the community. And then my last one of 2023, I have 5 Britt Elementary retired teachers coming on with me to talk about elementary school. So I'm real excited for those, and hopefully mixed in there, I have a interview with Mark Sanger after winning a state championship, and then all the seniors from that championship team. Knock on wood, keeping our fingers crossed that they'll continue doing what they're doing. So, all right, Doug, any last minute things we want to throw out there? Any shout outs or things you forgot?
I shout out to, all the West Hancock community. And, one thing's you go into teaching not for teaching's sake. You go into making an impact and difference in kids' lives. And I truly hope I did that for some of the kids that I met along the way, so well, that's my hope and dream.
You have a couple on here that sponsored the podcast, so I'd say you did all right.
All right.
Yeah. All right. I appreciate it, Doug, and go Eagles.
Go Eagles.